Well, how exciting is this? As we ready for puck drop, I want to welcome you to another really exciting episode of Digging In. In a minute, we're going to get to dig in with, I think, the top insider and reporter in Canada. And I mean, he knows how to dig in. He's got his black belt with regards to getting the information, people trusting him with the information. I mean, he might as well be at Baskin-Robbins. Well, they're not a current sponsor. Maybe they will be, because this guy who we're going to talk to in a minute, Elliotte Friedman, he knows how to get the scoop. Baskin-Robbins, you want to get on board? Let me know. But right now, I want to pay gratitude to our current sponsors. The great people at Allstate Fastener Corporation, one of the leading fastener distributors in the world, with exposure and expertise in the automotive industry, the heavy truck industry, tractor trailer, earth moving, which of course is near and dear to anybody who wants to dig in, those great companies in the earth moving industry, medical, gaming. I mean, I'm just scratching the surface of their unlimited expertise and range. Anything under the fastener umbrella, they can find it at good cost and quality. And if they need to, they have vendor managed inventory that can deliver it right to your line, right to your production line. The great people at Allstate Fastener. And that's allstatefastener.com if you want to learn more about that great company. The Vintage Wine Company. If you're within the state of Michigan and you have wholesale wine desires and needs, I want you to really reach out and touch and talk to the people at the Vintage Wine Company. They have tremendous knowledge. They have a full assortment from top-end wines to ones that provide great value. The owners of the company, family-owned, Mike and Michelle Giorgio, I think have a palate that would be reminiscent and comparable to the great Robert Parker. You can learn more about them, and if there's a fit, at VWCMI4Michigan.com. And finally, a new addition to our sponsorship list for this episode, and it gives me great pleasure to talk about what Hurricane great Stanley Cup winner, Chicago Blackhawks Stanley Cup winner, Winnipeg Jet captain, a current Islander coming all the way back from a couple of knee surgeries, Andrew Ladd and his beautiful wife, Brandy. They just celebrated an anniversary a couple of days ago. They have long been involved off the ice in a sturgeon fishing tournament out in the Vancouver area. They had to cancel because of COVID this summer. But you get a chance to go in very small numbers, sturgeon fish with an NHL star. Some of the guys that have been involved have been Mark Scheifele, Dustin Big Buff Bufflin. He's a tremendous angler. And all the proceeds go to enrich the lives of children. I want to encourage you to learn more by going to Andrew and Brandy's website. And that's the Ladd, of course, with 2Ds, foundation.org. Thank you so much for the generosity and the greatness of our sponsors. And now we will slide right into our catchy digging in tune that never gets old with me. And then we dig in with the great Elliotte Friedman.
Everywhere around the world, they're digging in with Tripp. Young and old, boys and girls, they're digging in with Tripp. Lace 'em up, it's time to go. They're digging in with Tripp. Lace 'em up, let's start the show. We're digging in with Tripp. 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 We're digging in with Tripp today, yeah.
Well, for this Digging In episode, I'm truly excited because there are all sorts of different ways to dig in and dig in deep. And one of those ways is in the reporting and being a true insider. I mean, the way that you dig in with trust, get the scoop, and you have to protect your sources. So along those lines, as I introduce my friend and my guest, I'm going to protect my source by saying a head coach for one of the Canadian teams in the NHL just recently said to me that Elliotte Friedman is the guy more than any of the other outstanding insiders that people in Canada look to the most. The Thought that was a heck of a compliment, but I'm going to protect my source who that head coach in Canada is. But I do want to welcome Elliotte Friedman to Digging In, sponsored by ZZ Top for those watching video with his follicle situation. Elliotte, I start every show, my friend, by saying, how do you define digging in?
First of all, let me just say which coaches wouldn't say that. So I think we could almost do that by process of elimination. Like, to me, I really think that digging in is an attitude. Not every day starts or continues as a great day. My grandmother had a great saying. She would always say, "You plan, God laughs." And, you played sports, it's easy to be a good guy or on top of your game when you're winning. But are you on top of your game, or do you find a way to get back to the top of your game when you're losing? So to me, I think digging in is all about when that swerve hits you, how do you deal with it? And if your day is not going well, how do you change it? And how do you consistently handle difficult challenges of life and treat people the way that you would hope to be treated? That's, to me, what digging in is.
Elliotte, I was planning on getting to this later because I think it's a defining moment where you turn a negative into a true positive. But now when you mention that, a few years ago, you were in Brazil during the Summer Olympics. You were calling the swimming event, and you got Ryan Lochte and Michael Phelps mixed up.
Mm-hmm.
You immediately took ownership, and then you apologized with complete accountability. And I just feel like all of Canada, they were already big fans of your work, could feel your genuine nature, could feel your honesty. What do you remember about that moment? Because anybody can get through the good times, of how you dealt with that challenging moment, and truly in the most admirable way you dug in.
Honestly, Tripp, I don't think I dealt with it that well. It's actually been one of the things that I've often felt that I didn't handle well enough. Not because of the apology or anything like that. I think that, look, I knew the rules of the game going in, that if I make a mistake, I make a mistake publicly. And I think if you're going to go into broadcasting, you have to understand that that's the way it is. Like, your mistakes, everybody sees them. In some ways, again, it's like being an athlete. Your mistake, everybody sees them. So, or a coach or a general manager or anything like that. So I've always understood that. I accepted that. I actually think that I didn't handle it really well because normally I've been, for lack of a better term, a pretty good goalie, in the sense that if I give up a bad goal, I move on. I say, here's my lesson. Here's what happened badly, and I'm going to fix it and go. That's the one time in my life, and I know why, but I'm not going to get into all those reasons, that I didn't let it go quick. Like, I think if I failed anything there, it's not just that I failed in terms of making the mistake, it's that I didn't recover fast enough. The next day I went on air, I was terrified. I've never been like that before. I think as I've looked back on that incident, I think the biggest disappointment I have about myself is how long it took me to, move past it. And I would be honest, and I would tell you it took me 3 years. I thought about that at least once every day for 3 years. And, there were a lot of emotions. The number one emotion, I was just mad at myself for doing it. But I was disappointed in myself that I couldn't turn the page. So I think it's nice that you feel that way, and I appreciate what you say, but I think it took me way too long to get over it. And I think that almost as big as the mistake was the fact that I dwelled on it for a long time. If I could turn the clock back, I'd turn it back in two ways. I wouldn't make the mistake in the first place, and I'd turn the page quicker. It took me a long time to get over it. And again, there's a reason for it, but I'm going to save that for my book. But people who are starting in broadcasting, they ask me about that all the time. And, the one thing I tell them is that you have to admit your mistakes. If you're wrong, and you're going to be wrong sometimes, or you're going to make mistakes, you have to accept responsibility for them. And the other thing I tell them is I think that's the only time in my life that I didn't get over something as fast as I needed to. And I've thought a lot about why that happened. And there never will be a next time. I'm never going to make a mistake that bad. but I'm also never going to take so long to get over it either.
Well, acceptance is that you can't find a solution before you take that first step of finding acceptance. I want to follow up on one front, my friend, because in Carolina, where I've long done television, we had Steve Smith. He's now in Buffalo as one of our coaches, and once I gained Steve's trust, Elliotte, he got comfortable telling me about what he went through when he had the gaffe that cost the Edmonton Oilers the series against Calgary, and what it meant to him the next year after puck goes off his stick and ends the series into his own net, that Wayne Gretzky gave him the Stanley Cup first. Mm-hmm. So just what that meant to, and Steve couldn't put it into words, Wayne doing that and how his team felt about him. Regardless of your self-reflection and holding on to that mistake in Rio, what did it mean to you, the outpouring of true support and genuine support? Because that's not even debatable.
Well, it meant a lot. Like, to be honest, Tripp, like when it was first started going on, and I was crushed. I was so incredibly disappointed in myself. Like, I had people who told me initially, get off, don't go on social media. So I didn't know. I was, my head was going in like 1,000 different directions. I should say first, I really appreciate it. Like, I've never seen it. Like, I've never gone back and I've never looked. But I heard what happened. I heard a lot of people tweeted in support, and I do appreciate it. I appreciate it a lot, but I've never seen it. I had people like you tell me that social media can be such a pile on, and a lot of people didn't pile on. And I think it was because of, like I said, I ate it. Like, sometimes life, Tripp, it serves you up a double-decker shit sandwich, and you've got no choice but to open your mouth and bite right in. And that's what I did. So I think people appreciated that and identify with that. And like I said, I do appreciate it. I never really saw it. I was shocked, though, at just, people who reached out, text, direct message, emails, calls, things like that. One story I've never told, and I'll tell it now. One of the guys who really went out of his way to try to give me advice on how to handle it was Mike Babcock. And, I was really torn last year as Babcock went through his situation. I had people who said to me that, I was too easy on him. I had people who said to me I was too hard on him. But it was like, hey, he lost his job. He made a mistake with the Mitch Marner thing. He never should have done it. But I didn't want to join the pile-on because I'd seen a person who had really helped me out a great deal when I was at a low point. And, I think that's the one thing that I think in the social media world, Tripp, I think we get judged too often by what we put out there. And I think there's a lot of really good people out there who believe if you do good things, you don't tell everyone. And you work under the radar, and you do things privately, and you do things, face to face. I'm a big believer in that. And the amount of people I didn't know who reached out in social media meant a lot. The amount of people I did know that I was surprised who reached out meant a lot. I think, Tripp, you can tell me if you think differently. I think 90% of the people that we meet are really good people, and 10% ruin it for everybody else. And in that whole incident, that kind of confirmed it to me.
And worry about the 90% that are good.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that story about Stanley Cup winning, couple-time Olympic winning coach for Canada, Mike Babcock. He's a product of the collegiate system in Alberta. I want to go back now. This is well known in Canada, but for the American listeners to digging in. So from 89 to 93, you go to Western.
Yeah.
In London, you study English, and if you could just maybe tell a story like only you can of how that eventually is led you to where you're at now. You have broadcasting stints with the Toronto Raptors, the Toronto Blue Jays. If you could just tell your story in your own words.
Well, I was a kid, Tripp, who loved sports. I realized at a young age I was not going to play them at an elite level for two reasons. One, I wasn't exactly a gifted athlete, and number two, which I think is even more important, Tripp, at that point, like, what was the first question you asked me? Like, what's digging in? I didn't dig in as a kid. Like, I think you can split life into two groups of people: those who peaked in high school and those who didn't. And I was definitely in Group B. I would say I was a soft kid. I didn't have, I don't think I always tell this to young people. I don't think you need to be a jerk, but I think you need to have edge. I think you have to believe in yourself. And I think you have to have a willingness to stand up for yourself and force yourself to compete in situations that are not easy. And, I think I was a kid who, when things got hard, I backed down. And I tell people that just because you back down when you were younger doesn't mean you're going to be that necessarily have to be that way when you're older. You can change. And I was one of those people. I think I was a really soft kid, and I didn't have the commitment, to be we just watched the Michael Jordan documentary, right? Like, not only was he the best player, but he was the most determined. He was going to kill you. He was going to rip your heart out. And I think you have to have some of that to be successful. I wasn't like that. But I love sports, and I wanted to write for Sports Illustrated. There was a time when, we were younger, Tripp, that if you wanted to be a sports writer, which I wanted to be, Sports Illustrated was the number one job. And that's what I wanted to be. And I picked Western because it had a great student newspaper that sent a lot of people into media. And, so I worked at that student paper. I did take English. I don't have my degree yet. I don't want anyone to think I'm into, I'm into resume falsifying here. I don't have my degree. And then I finished school in '93. I didn't have my degree yet, but it was time. And, I struggled. I struggled to get a foothold. The economy was bad. It wasn't like now, but it was bad. And I couldn't get a full-time, I couldn't get in. My father, I remember at that time, he would always say to me, this is not about you or your ability. This is about just the way the situation is right now. And I'd be like, shut up, Dad. I don't want to hear this stuff. I'm depressed. Leave me alone with this talk. And he was right. That's another thing I tell people. Sometimes it's you and sometimes it's circumstance. And the important thing is to recognize one and the other. And at that point in time, it was circumstance. Finally, I knew someone who wanted to help me open a door. And I kept on saying, no, I'm going to do this myself. And, I think that's stupid in retrospect. Somebody can open up a door for you, but only you decide if you're keeping that open. I remember when that door was finally open to me at the Fan Radio in Toronto, I started at the same time as a guy whose father was the vice president of sales there. And I lasted and the other guy didn't, because I was better and I worked harder. And, I was like everybody. I worked my way up. I started small. I remember one of the first times I went on air, Tripp, I was covering the Canadian Open tennis in Toronto. And I said that Andre Agassi just won his match in straight sets. And I thought I was going to get fired, and they were all laughing their heads off. And, I worked, I worked a lot. This is a bad thing to say now, but I think it was critical for me at that time. I once worked 121 straight days. Now a company would go to jail if you did that. But I look back at that as a time that really got me going. It separated me from other people, and it convinced them that this guy's serious. And, I loved it. I wanted to do well. And the thing that really helped is I was always a good reporter. I had other skills I needed to get better at, but I was always a good reporter.
You just took me right into, and I'm going to look down at my notes because a journalist that is so well known for his contributions in days gone by in Canada, Bob Makowitz Sr. Okay, so he was quoted. This is a quote from you initially. When I was young, I brought the heat all the time. And Bob said, you've got to be like a pitcher. Sometimes you've got to bring the heat, but sometimes you've got to bring the other stuff too. And as a guy, I do some interviews, the art of the interview. How would you say you feel it out when to bring the heat and when to bring the other stuff?
Well, there's sometimes that, if you have a certain amount of, like, for example, in TV, a lot of times, Tripp, you've only got 2 or 3 minutes, right? Like, especially in a live broadcast of a game. Hey, you better if there's something you feel you need to get to, you got to get to it quick, right? But I think there's first of all, a lot of people that you're talking to, they know if you're coming at them with a particular topic. If we're requesting someone, chances are they're like, okay, I know what they want to talk about, or they ask, like, what are we talking about? So there aren't as many surprises as there used to be. It's a very different world now. But I think the one thing now is that I just think you've got to be able to come at them from a different thing. Like, you can't be the same way all the time. And the other thing, Bob Makowitz, another guy there named Nelson Millman, always used to tell me was, Elliotte, it's just sports. Like, lighten up a bit. They thought I was too serious. And, I just think that I'm a big believer in stick to your strengths, but I'm also a big believer in don't be afraid to take chances once in a while. And some of those chances have really blown up in my face, like a grade 10 chemistry experiment. But other chances, it's really worked out well. And, I just think the number one thing is, does your guest believe that you're going to be fair to them? Like, one of the things I know that drives, I'll tell you this, I have this a lot, Tripp. Like, if I do an interview that's hard hitting and it's taped, people ask me, like, how are you going to edit this? Are you going to make me look bad? And, that's one thing that people really worry about. I think at the end of the day, whether the questions are hard or they're challenging or they're fun, they just want to know that you're going to be at least fair with them. If they have to present a side, even if it's not a popular side, are they going to feel that you're going to give them a fair chance, the justice to do their side? And I think most people, there are definitely exceptions, most people think I'm fair, although, there are certainly people who absolutely hate my guts.
Rarity. They might be in Antarctica, but I want to follow up because this just came up, Elliotte, because we were doing some pre-production for our Fox regional broadcast for the exhibition game the Hurricanes are going to have with the Caps, and then the Ranger qualification series. And a guy like Sebastian Aho, you get him on a Zoom, he's really come into his own. His interview is outstanding. But if you have a bench interview, which of course all television people like, Sebastian, he has a ritual right down to the second in a warm-up. Eric Stahl was the same way when he was a Hurricane. So you're in studio now, but when you were doing bench interviews, how did you take that into consideration? Because some guys, like for me, Justin Williams, the warm-up gets in the way for him. He could sit and talk the whole time, but some guys, you could ask the brilliant question, you're still not going to get the answer you're looking for.
Well, I do agree with that. Like, if the subject of the interview is in a situation where they don't want to do it, there's almost nothing you can do. Like, sometimes I've had situations where I've pulled out a miracle, but a lot of the times, but the one thing I also do believe is that I believe there's too much in TV of, these walk-off interviews are a joke, so I can just do throwaway questions. Like, that doesn't work either. I had players who told me over the years that I surprised them with a question and walk-off that made them think. And I like that. I think it's challenging. They're not going to be perfect, but you can do them differently and make them more interesting. I think in general, we should look at different ways, though, to do these interviews. Like, one of the things that we do in our broadcast now is, and our producers, there are some producers that have really good thoughts. They'll say, can we do you 2 hours before the game in the hallway in your jersey? And one of our producers sets up like 2 stools outside the dressing room, so the player's a little bit more relaxed. Or sometimes we do them like before the player walks onto the ice, or maybe when the players finish the warm-up, the group comes walking back off, and then one guy comes over to the side and does an interview. I agree that I'm not convinced the bench anymore is the right place unless you're interviewing a coach, but I do think it's important for these players to talk. And so I look at it 2 ways. One, I think, especially now, I think players in hockey have to challenge themselves to give better and more revealing answers. But I also think we as broadcasters have to do a job of putting them in an environment where they're more comfortable. Like, I would say Like I would go to a team right now. I would, because you guys have a great PR staff, right? Like Mike and
Yes.
Pace.
Yep.
And if there's anybody I'm missing, I'm sorry, but Mike says it's all him. So if there's anyone else there, it's all his fault. What I would do is I would go to the player at the beginning of the year, say bench or no bench, okay? Between period or no between period. And then like say puck drops at 7. Can we do 5 o'clock? How do you feel about an interview at 5 o'clock? Find out what all the comfort levels are and just say, okay, like, so if we're doing Justin Williams pregame, he's bench. If we're doing Sebastian Aho pregame, he's 5 o'clock. If we're doing Jordan Staal pregame, it's walking out of the room, going on the ice for warm up. If we're doing Jacob Slavin before the game, it's after the warm up's over and he's walking off the ice. I would say go to all your players, say here's multiple choice. If they want you, how do you feel about all this? And maybe that'll work.
That's on a variety of different levels. I mean, those are great thoughts from the man with 31 thoughts. We're going to get to that in a minute. But whether it be your true love, which is reporting, and also simultaneously that, as the one Canadian head coach that will remain nameless said, you are the ultimate insider right now within Canada. That's either one's built on trust. So this question, I'm going to protect the source, comes from another coach, this one in the United States right now. And it reads, how were you able to get the high-ups to speak to you off the record? Because it's all about trust, isn't it?
Well, the number one thing is, and so Brian Burke is one of my coworkers now. He's at Sportsnet. Berkey and I went for a year without talking. Like when he was the GM in Toronto, we had a big blow up. Yeah. And it was over James Reimer, actually.
A cane.
Yeah, a cane. So, and he was so mad at me, and I was so mad at him. And he says to me, he's now like Tripp. He's like, whenever we joke, it's like we didn't talk for a year, and Berkey goes, and it was all Elliotte's fault, and I just laugh like, and I roll my eyes and I just laugh because we're teammates now, and it happened a long time ago, so you can just laugh it off. And but the one thing Berkey and I, we had our battles, but the one thing he said to me was, Elliotte, the advantage that you have is that you respect confidentiality. Nobody knows who you talk to. And he used to say that in a couple of his organizations, because he worked in half the league, he said that there would be arguments over who I would talk to, and they would never know. And I think that's the thing, Tripp, is that people have to know. Like, I've had people call me up and say, tell me who told you that. And I'm like, no. And they scream at me. And I say, how would you feel? This line always works. I say, how would you feel if you told me something in confidence, and the moment somebody screamed at me, I gave you up? And they're like, all right, I get that. Now, that makes some people even angrier, but, I think most people understand that. I just think that, what I think it comes down to, Tripp, honestly, it's like, again, do you treat people fairly? Do you try to treat people right? Like, there are people who say to me that you don't clobber enough people, like you don't rip enough people. I'm a person that I believe treat people like I'd like to be treated. Like there's sometimes I deserve to be ripped, and if people do it, that's fine. But I think the other thing is, if you're a guy who rips someone all the time, it loses its power. And people talk, like they say, if you do it once in a while, then it has meaning. And I think that I really always try to say, is there a reason for that something happened, and try to find out. I just think that I keep people's names secret, and I try to treat them fairly. And I think most people, that's all they really ask for.
Well, the vault of trust is called the vault for a reason. And I want to follow up with Berkey because he dug in on the podcast here last week. And then, I went back and revisited, I love 31 Thoughts, and I want to get to that in a minute. But you recently just talked about in 31 Thoughts in June that Berkey, that Mr. Truculence, voting for the Lady Bing. I mean, how do you vote for the Lady Bing, our dear friend Berkey, who dug in with Truculence?
I have trouble voting for the Lady Byng. I'll tell you that much. Jacob Slavin was number 2 on my ballot for the Lady Byng. There was another defenseman who I put number 1. That's a tough one to vote for. I think defensemen, by the way, get totally shafted for that award. They play more than anybody else. Usually they're defending as opposed to attacking. They're the ones that have to play down low, whereas, it's easier to hook and hold, Tripp, because, your defensemen in front of you all those years were cheaters, just like all defensemen are. And I find that awards, I basically take the best players with the fewest penalty minutes, the guys who play the most minutes and the hardest minutes, and I throw them into a hat and I try to pick between them. And I think defensemen get totally robbed on that award, and that's why I put Slavin up there this year and one other defenseman in front of him.
So that same coach who's singing your praises, the anonymous one, he said, everybody looks to 31 Thoughts. There are all sorts of writers that have tried to replicate it in some form or fashion. You and I were talking offline. When did your concept for 31 Thoughts first pop into your head? And then how did it unfold to a point now where everybody looks to it, quite candidly? Don't let this go to your head, but everybody looks at 31 Thoughts.
I can assure you it's not going to go to my head. You got to keep that grinder mentality, Tripp. It happened a few years ago, and there's a producer I used to work with. His name's Doug Walton, and he actually produces the Blue Jays now. He doesn't produce hockey anymore. And we worked together at Hockey Night in Canada, and I was a sideline reporter, and he was the game producer. And he would always say to me, I said as a sideline reporter, there's a lot of people who think that sideline reporters are useless. That used to drive me bananas. I used to feel that I had to make the position important. So I always felt it was important to come with a list of things that only I could get on the broadcast. And obviously other people could do it too, but I took it as a responsibility that I could find it out. And they would have to get on. And, I did reasonably enough well that there would be times, and Tripp, you work live games, you never know what's going to happen. Sometimes there's no room for the sideline reporter. And he would say to me, Elliotte, every week there's stuff that you have that we just don't get on the air. Why don't you write a column on this stuff? And I thought about it, and it was a really good idea. And I wanted to make it different. And, I'll tell you, I like alliteration. And at that time, it was 30 teams in the league. So I came up with 30 thoughts. And I will tell you, Tripp, there's some weeks I'm at 21 and 22, and I'm like, you're an idiot. And some weeks it's easy. The commissioner once asked me, he's great about this. He calls it 31 things. Yeah. And he said to me, are you going to go to 32 when Seattle comes in? And I said, yes, and please stop expanding. And so that's kind of the way. It went to 31 when Vegas come in. It went to 32 with Seattle. And, I didn't realize for a time, I didn't realize how red it was. Because there's some people in our business, Tripp, that go crazy about ratings. How many people watched my show? How many people listened to my podcast? And I've seen it drive some people absolutely crazy. So I always look at it prepare as if 1 billion people are reading it, even though they're not. And, I think that one of the reasons I still do it, Tripp, is that people do read it. And you appreciate the fact that you have an audience and you're doing it a lot for them. There are people who people find value in it, so it drives you to be good at it.
You mentioned our fine commissioner, and I was planning on asking you this question with your insight, your insider information. In these difficult, challenging pandemic times, what impressed you the most that Gary Bettman and Donald Fehr, the head of the Players Association, dug in and were able to ensure and find long-term labor peace recently?
I think that the most impressive thing about it was they got it done. Because as Tripp, as you know, in this sport, that never comes easy. They got it done. And that's the number one thing. Because results matter. It's a results business, and that was the result. But the number two thing I think that was, and it was close to me almost as impressive as number one, is they kept it out of the public domain. You look what happened in baseball. That was ugly. It was ugly. And Tripp, people out there are really struggling right now. If it's not COVID, it's your job. It's you're in a small group. Are my kids going to be able to go back to school? I have trouble working when I don't have school or daycare or childcare for my kids. Like, it's a lot. The podcast just came out. It just dropped as we were taping this, and one of the people we interview in it this week is a sleep doctor, Dr. Pat Burner. He used to work with the Vancouver Canucks, and he's coming out with a book. And one of the things we talked about was sleeping in the pandemic. And but that's the thing. Like, you look at, like, people do not want to hear about millionaires, billionaires, and athletes fighting with each other right now. And baseball had it, and the NFL was starting to have it a little bit, and they kept it out. Like, there were problems, and Fear had a rockier ride to it than Bettman did. But they acted like adults in the room, and they said, we're getting a deal done because we think it's the best for our groups. And they got it done. And I'm impressed with that because, as you know, in this sport, it hasn't been easy.
No. And part of that deal, and shortly we're going to enjoy a round of exhibition games and then games that really matter in tournament fashion, and then all part of the Stanley Cup playoffs in the bubble. So even though you're going to be in the Sportsnet studio outside the bubble, I want to ask you about both bubbles.
Okay.
Start with Edmonton. Let's go from west to east. What do you think is going to be the most interesting part of that Edmonton bubble, and what's going to be the most challenging part of that Edmonton bubble?
Well, I think the most challenging part of the Edmonton bubble, and actually I would say for both, is that for 14 days, they're not going to want people going anywhere, really. One of the things they've talked about, for example, as this moves on, is when a team is off, can they have a golf day? Basically, Tripp, like, my family is really socially distanced. We have a situation where we're very careful because one of us is a little bit more vulnerable. So we haven't really seen a lot of people. And, we've only gone out to eat, I think, twice. So we have to be really careful. And there are times we've gone stir crazy. Like, I always joke that the biggest loser in all of this is my wife and her boyfriend. Like, they can't see each other. So, I think that's going to be one of the challenges is in the first couple of weeks when they really want to seal it and make sure that there's no outbreak or nothing like that. They're going to ask the players to really stay close. And in the NBA bubble where we saw all that great video, there was a while after they got into it where they didn't have to play games. So there was just practice and then have fun. Like the NHL one, you're going to get there, and then 3 days later, your exhibition games start. So I think that, first of all, I hope that we see an NHL bubble Twitter and Instagram feed. I hope some of the players and the league come up with something really interesting to show what these guys are doing. But I think the biggest challenge Tripp is going to be at the beginning. They're really not going to want you to go anywhere, like even as a group, to things like golf and stuff like that. So I think that's going to be the challenge, is getting past that stage where you're going to see the same people an awful lot.
Your wife and her boyfriend. Well, I've always suspected the reason I turned out the way I did is because I'm the milkman's kid. But moving on, do you see, you just spoke of Edmonton and some commonalities. Do you see Toronto and the challenges and the interesting parts being any different and unique from Alberta?
I think the challenge for Alberta was that they came in late. Like, Alberta put in and I shouldn't say that, they were aggressive from the beginning, but from what I understand, they weren't really a serious possibility until right at the end. Like, they were always there. They were always aggressive, but they weren't near the top of the list. Like, from the beginning, I think if the league could have done it, it would have been Toronto and Vegas. And, Toronto fell apart because they were worried that they couldn't keep the bubble in Toronto. It was too dense downtown. And all of a sudden they redid their bid and got back in. And Vegas was number one all the way until it got really bad there right at the end. And all of a sudden Edmonton was back in. So I think Edmonton, they were a bit behind in terms of restaurants, planning, how things were going to be put together in terms of construction of sealed off areas and stuff like that, the hotel setup, things like that. I think Edmonton was a little bit behind, so that made it a bigger challenge. But I know one thing Edmonton did. They said, whatever you want, we're going to make it work. And they have had that attitude.
Boy, in both the West and the East, so exciting to think about. The qualification round is going to begin. Best of 5 series. If you had to pick one series that is most intriguing to you, what would it be?
Well, I think in the East, number 1, I would pick Toronto Columbus, and number 2, I would pick Carolina Rangers. And the reason I picked Toronto Columbus is I think it's the biggest contrast in styles. You've got the skill of the Maple Leafs versus the will of the Blue Jackets. And you've got John Tortorella already refusing to talk to the media after an inter-squad scrimmage last night. So he's in prime playoff mode. He's ready to go. Carolina Rangers, I think it's a really interesting series. They caused you a lot of aggravation this year. They were getting hot. People have asked me, give me a Stanley Cup contender. I think the Hurricanes are really good. I just think that David Quinn's going to got all the bulletin board material in the world of, the Hurricanes and their playoff proposals and all that stuff. So I think it's going to be a great series. I think those are the 2 best series in the East. In the West, did you see what Connor McDavid said yesterday about the media not knowing how to vote for awards? That's a guy who's a little unhappy. He's not a harder. Hey, Lindsay, he's going to come out. I have a feeling he's going to come out of this like a house on fire. So Edmonton, Chicago is a big one for me. And I think Winnipeg, Calgary is going to be a dynamite series too.
Boy, just to piggyback, again, part of your June edition of 31 Thoughts. And, I do. I'm engrossed in it. Okay. And when Connor McDavid was hurt, Leon Draisaitl came into Carolina. It was a Sunday afternoon. I mean, he was unbelievable, Elliotte. Aho was on the other side. I mean, it was tit for tat, toe to toe. The Oilers won in overtime. Draisaitl was a beast. But you mentioned in 31 Thoughts, and I thought it was really intriguing going back to Lemieux and Jagr in Pittsburgh, the argument you would make that 2 players could be finalists for the Hart Trophy, league MVP, from the same team.
Yeah, I had some people tell me, how can Draisaitl be the MVP of the league when he's got McDavid on his team? You can't have that. And I think that's I hate that argument. Just because you got 2 great players on a team doesn't mean they're MVP, not MVP level players. And the other thing too is, Tripp, from all your career, when you're going into a year, are you any good or not? Are we good or are we not good? And, Edmonton, nobody thought they were going to be any good this year. Nobody did. And, McDavid ripped up his knee in the last game of the season, and he charges back over the summer and puts in the work. And I have to tell you, in this summer, I heard he was going to be out for 6 weeks. I heard he wasn't coming back until December. And I think he was worried he wasn't going to be back until December. And he shows up for game 1, and Draisaitl, and they just showed up like beasts. And I think when you have a team that isn't very good or isn't thought to be very good, and your 2 best players show up with that kind of attitude and start playing, it changes a team. And I think McDavid gets shafted in voting. I really think he does. And I don't know. To me, part of being an MVP is setting the right, not only being a great player on the ice, which is important, but setting the right tone around your team. And I thought those 2 guys did. To me, those guys are MVPs. I don't care if they play on the same team.
Whether it be McDavid, a Draisaitl, or any of the other players playing, 24 teams with a chance shortly, playing without fans, the adjustments, and players have all said they're not going to know until they're actually in that atmosphere. What do you think are the things that are going to be different that players, coaches have to keep in mind to try to somehow use advantageously?
Well, I think Rod Brind'Amour is going to have to watch his language. I think that, and honestly, I got to tell you, there's going to be a delay, it sounds like, Tripp, but I think that's crazy. People swear, who cares? But whatever. I mean, I understand some people are very sensitive, and I think in social media, some people like to make an issue out of everything. So I understand all of the concerns. I think you're going to hear everything. I think that's going to be interesting. I think that's going to be great. As we know, they've asked fans to send some video of themselves cheering for their teams. Like, I think there's going to be screens set up all around the low seats so that, for example, if Carolina's playing the Rangers and Dougie Hamilton scores, they can put Carolina fans on the screens cheering for Carolina. I think that's going to be an interesting one. I've heard they've talked about goal songs, each team bringing their own goal songs there. There's some rumors about the cannon from Columbus. Are they going to bring the sound effect? Or are they going to be able to just I think they should bring the actual cannon, but I have a feeling it might just be the sound effect. I think they're going to try to personalize this as much as they can. I know at one point they talked about, do we hire DJs? I don't think that's going to happen. But I think if there was a picture that came out today, I saw of the NBA court, and there's like a lot of stuff around the side of the court. Like, I could see it being unusually distracting for a player, at least at the beginning. Like, whoa, usually I'm used to people. Now there's these screens and everything there. So I'm really curious to see. I have a feeling that the NHL is going to unveil all this stuff, I think, on Thursday. So I'm wondering if it's going to be lots of screens and lots of stuff to try to make it feel more like a studio setup and more intimate.
Boy, that Columbus cannon, that's gotten me every time over the years, even when I know it's coming. That's all over YouTube. Oh my gosh. I just hope if that cannon comes, it's got a quarantine. I got it. You're a family man.
Yeah.
And you're private about your family. But I want to ask you, because I've been up with my mom in Michigan before I came back down to Carolina, spending time with her. So if I'm watching a movie at 10 o'clock at night, okay, Sidney Crosby or Wayne Gretzky could call me. They're going right to voicemail. I mean, how do you, Elliotte Friedman, actually, does your wife or your kids ever say, hey, Elliotte, put the phone on the kitchen counter for an hour. It's off limits? Because I'm just a lowly color commentator, and you always respond immediately to me. I mean, do you ever say, hey, listen, this is going to voicemail?
I do, more than I ever did before. But first of all, you may be a lowly color commentator, but Wayne Gretzky and Sidney Crosby aren't calling me Tripp. I'll tell you that right now. Probably more now, but like, Rogers is good about one thing. Like, in the regular season, I'm on call like 24/7, but from July 1st until Labor Day, I don't have to do anything. Like, they're really good about that. Season, you're working. Elsewhere, you're not. You're clear. So I respect that about them. There are times, like my son who's 8, he will say to me, like, Daddy, stop looking at the phone. And sometimes my wife will just say, do you listen to me when I speak? And those moments, like, that's just bad. Like, Tripp, it's just bad. But I'm not as good about it as I should be. I wish I was better. But I will say this. One thing I always promise them: whenever I'm thrown out of this business, I'm going to get rid of all my accounts and I'm going quiet. I'm going dark, and you will have my full attention. I promise you.
Well, I'd figure with that ZZ Top beard, for the people watching on YouTube, and tuning in with video, you're just going to go straight to the mountains once you call it a day.
I would love that. I'm going to be a ghost. When I am done, no one is ever going to hear from me again. And they'll probably be happy about that too.
A ghost hanging out with the goats, with the beard.
That's right.
I want to go back to that anonymous coach in one of the NHL markets in the U.S.,
Okay.
And he asked me, he's a huge Elliotte fan.
Yeah.
And he said, when putting a rumor out there, despite probably being true, do you think about how the player might feel when he hears it?
A ton. Tripp, like that goes back to what we talked about earlier about when I was in the breaking into the business. I was 23 years old and I was single. I didn't get married till I was 39. I was single. I was, when you're that age, like I was probably like most guys, like I was a total cement head at that age. And as you get older, you get more life experience. You have a family. I'm married now. I have one child. I think I always understood that I think I always understood that try to treat people respectfully and try to understand that other people have feelings. But that when I was young and starting out and I'm trying to get going, like you're bringing the heat all the time. You're like, well, that's news and you just have to deal with it. I think as I got older, I understood that it affected people. One thing I really try to do, Tripp, is I always try to warn people in advance. Like, this is coming. I'm hearing this. On days like trade deadline and free agency, it's impossible to do that. Twitter has changed it. There's no question, because now, like, sometimes you'll hear, oh, someone else is chasing this story too. So, oh, you don't want to lose the story. And there have been times I've lost the story because I've waited and I wasn't sure, or I didn't get a chance to reach someone and someone beat me to it. But I do all the time, Tripp. I really try all the time to warn the player or the agent or the team. I understand that it can throw people's life into craziness. And I really try my best to mitigate that as much as I can, although I admit I'm not always successful and it can't always be done. To me, I really, really think it's one of the hardest things about the job is knowing that what I report can have an effect on someone, and especially their family, because I'm very protective of my family and I am very sensitive to the player signs up for this, or the GM or the coach signs up for this, but the family doesn't always sign up for this. And I try to be very respectful and understanding of that.
In my opinion, because this isn't my first rodeo, is that players, coaches, managers, they can all feel that. And because of that, they have a level of trust. They know you have a tough job to do, but they can feel that. And by the way, Elliotte, since you're digging in with me for an hour, if some story's breaking right now and, the great Elliotte Friedman misses it, I owe you dinner anywhere in North America. Take a quick look to make sure we're not missing anything.
The only thing that happened is our podcast dropped, but I can wait to tweet that out when we're done here.
So your podcast is outstanding, you and Jeff Merrick. And I want to ask you, because you mentioned being a grinder earlier, and you said, television, we're a team just like the guys on the ice, and we all have different roles. And I think it's brilliant that, you're the great studio that we'll see shortly with Ronnie McLean, with you, with Brian Burke, Kelly Rudy, among others. Can you just explain how, in your words, there are grinders and there are elite players, and how you have to know your role, approach your role with the right mindset, and how it all comes together?
Tripp, as I've gotten older, I believe that every successful player is a grinder. Like you mentioned Sidney Crosby earlier. When Sidney Crosby was breaking in, one of the reasons that guys like, Gary Roberts and the older guys thought he was going to be such a great player, Mark Recchi, was because he was a superstar player with the mentality of a fourth liner. And, I remember, for example, Jordan Staal. Like, Jordan Staal to me is a star player. And I remember when he was young, his first season was really impressive. His second season, he struggled a bit and he had trouble scoring. And I remember we went to go do a game in Pittsburgh once, and they used to have a strength coach named Mike Kadar. And and Jordan Staal was struggling. I remember in the old rink there, there was a long hallway, and he would be tied up to a sled. He would have the harness on and the sled behind him, and there would be like a bunch of weights that just hurt to look at on the sled, never mind just lift. And he's pulling it down the hallway. And I remember Mike Kadar saying to me, I don't care what the numbers are, he's going to be a star because of this. And nobody gets away. I think you can get to a certain level of talent alone, but you're not going to be great, supremely great, unless you have that grinder's mentality. So I think we're all grinders, but sometimes talent and pure talent does separate people from other people. I know what I don't know. Tripp, I remember, so I got hired at Hockey Night in Canada. I was 33. I'd been in the business for 10 years. I remember sitting at a skate with Glenn Healy and I think Greg Millen. And Healy turned to me and says, "You don't know how to watch practice." And I was like, "What?" he goes, you're talking to people, you're leaving early to go down to the room. You don't know what you're doing. And I go, okay, so tell me. And he said, okay, why is that coach talking to that person? Why did that coach stop that drill there? Look at the look that player is giving to that player after he butchered that drill. It was like an eye opener. And, I have always believed that I think I know a lot about hockey, and I think I've learned a lot about hockey, but I just don't instinctively see it at the same level that people who played the game did. And I think that's why I see my role as stick to your strengths, maybe create an argument once in a while, but leave the general expertise to the experts. And that's the role. I agree with that. Like, fill your role. And I see my role as, is there anything we're missing in this broadcast? Is there any storyline we need to have in it? And that's what I see as my job.
It's well said. You're making me think about all the years going to practice, because I'll get criticized because I won't sit with the harem, because, they'll say, well, what are you? Do you don't want to be around us? And I say, no, if I come sit with you, I'm running for mayor. I am an analyst. My job is to really watch. If I'm going to be there, I have to watch. Mm-hmm. And that's the fun. I love that during a playoff series, Elliotte, because a lot of times in this day and age, rest is such a weapon. You don't practice. Usually you either have a practice on the day off between games and no morning skate, or vice versa. But I love that part of it, because then you get a chance to really see adjustments, which I think is a really exciting part of the job as an analyst in playoff time.
I agree with that. There's always something you can pick up. There's always something you can pick up that, you're looking at and you're saying, And people know if you're watching too. Like Ron Wilson, when he was the coach of the Leafs, he'd be like Leafs media, they don't watch practice. They just sit and talk to each other.
I remember when Kirk Muller was coaching Carolina at one point, he just made sure I was watching. He shot up a puck, and I had to grab it. Was just about hitting me right between the eyes.
Sounds like something he'd do. That's pretty funny.
One of my favorites, and I think he was onto something actually with the Hurricanes. I'm a huge, huge Kirk Muller fan, and if I was in an alley late at night, he's a guy I'd call because I know he'd be there. He's that kind of guy. Looking down at my notes, I want to, because we've spoken about, you're very private about your family, but whenever you see Elliotte Friedman, whenever you see him, you see that beautiful blue autism puzzle piece on your lapel. And I just, if it's okay, I'd like to ask you why autism is so close and near and dear to your heart.
Well, you can, I'm sure I'll answer it, Tripp, but, I won't go too much into it. There's certain people in our family that have asked for privacy, and I respect that. We just have a connection in the family to someone being on the spectrum. And it's not hard to figure out if you followed my career where it is, but it goes back to what we talked about at the beginning of the interview, is that you plan and God laughs. And so I'm proud of the way that our family has embraced the challenge. I'm proud of what we've accomplished together. There's a lot more to do. I'm proud of the people in particular who've embraced it. And, there's a lot of people with a lot bigger problems out there. Comparatively, we're lucky. We have a positive outlook. I think that, the situation had a lot to do with the way I reacted after Rio and why I struggled so much after it. But, I'm proud of where we've come and where we're going. That's what I'll say. And I've had people reach out to me privately and say that it means a lot to them that I wear that ribbon or pin, because it lets them know that they're not alone. And that's part of the reason I do it, is that I want people out there to know nobody gets through life unscathed, Tripp. We all have our challenges. So you're never alone out there. There's always people who sympathize and empathize with you.
And one of those people I know, without divulging, is somebody that you're very close with, and perhaps has come up in this interview.
Yeah, it's one of the anonymous coaches. Yes.
Yeah. I want to, because I mentioned Kirk Muller being there for me in an alley late at night. I'll never forget this. I was doing a game in Anaheim years ago. It was 4-on-4, I think, in overtime. And I think it was my buddy Timmy Peel had a tough moment, maybe missed a call. And I mean, you get out to the bus, the media bus next to the players' bus in Anaheim, and you feel like nobody's watching. And I didn't know you then like I knew you now, like I know you now. I mean, we had a good relationship, but it meant so much to me, Elliotte, because I wasn't on Twitter. I think you just sent me a text or you put it out on Twitter, and somehow I became aware of it, that you were proud of the way that I mentioned that the referee made a mistake, but didn't throw him under the bus. And I just wanted to tell you how much that meant to me, because I didn't feel good, because if it was Timmy Peel, he's a dear friend of mine. And I wanted to tell you that meant an absolute ton to me. You staying up late at night, you never miss a game, that you did that.
Well, I will have one friend who, in particular, who will text me after he watches this, one of my best buddies, and he will say, do you know that you're the only loser who stayed up till 1:30 in the morning to watch Carolina Anaheim that night in Canada? And, and I'll laugh about that. Like I said, like honestly, like I really believe, Tripp, that look, like we all screw up, right? Like, and we, we know we signed up for this. You make a mistake, I make a mistake, Tim Peel makes a mistake. Everyone's going to see it. Like, we signed up for it. We can't complain about it. We knew the job going in. And so, like, I think in those moments, like, especially the thing too, like, Tripp, you work for a Carolina broadcast, right? And your fans love you guys. And, they're watching the Hurricanes and they're like, God damn it. Like, this hurts the Hurricanes. Like, this sucks. And, and if you're invested to the point where, like, for example, like me, you're staying up late to watch the Hurricanes play in Anaheim, like, you're a fan, you're like, rah! And like, at that moment, your fans are probably expecting you to put the shovel on Tim Peel. And I think that it's the easy thing to do. And the hard thing to do, I think, sometimes is say, you know what, I'm going to point it out because I can't avoid it. But, I'm not going to roll the truck back over the guy. And that's karma. And I believe in good karma and karma points.
Well, it's so well. So, what you got me thinking about now is, your text or your tweet, whatever, that night meant the world to me, because I pointed it out if it was Timmy, without throwing him under the bus. Now I have to, be accountable, because you just made me think about the first round of the playoffs last year. It's no secret in Carolina that, and I've fallen in love with the kid that Andrei Svechnikov is.
Yeah.
I call him my brother, my nephew. He said, we have a close relationship. And I can remember vividly Game 3, Washington and Carolina. And we're calling the game, and Alex Ovechkin and Andrei dropped the gloves. And obviously Alex doesn't fight very often, but he's a beast.
Yeah.
And, he obviously beats Andrei decisively. And when Andrei went down, I was so emotional about it as a Carolina guy and loving Andrei Svechnikov. My emotions got the better of me, because I acted like Alex had a chance to end that fight when they hit the ice, and all he was trying to do was brace. Mm-hmm. And that's an example where, I don't mind the emotion that I was standing up for Andrei Svechnikov, but I still say that Alex Ovechkin claims that Andrei said that he asked him to go, and that's not the way that as Andrei said, what am I, a superhero? I didn't ask him to go, but I let the emotions get the better of me, thinking that Alex extended that fight when Andrei's head hit the ice. That was where the emotions, being a Hurricanes guy, got the better of me.
Yeah, but the thing is, like here's the way I look at that, Tripp. Like, I remember watching that. Like, we're doing that game, right? And actually, I don't know if I was doing that game specifically, but we're all there watching it because there's all the games going on at the same time. And that was a holy bleep moment. Like, when we saw those two guys fighting, you're like, what on earth is happening here? And I remember the building too. Like, the building they were in shock, and then they were excited, and then they were in shock again. And I think in the moment you're like, wow, like Ovi and Svechnikov are fighting. You're like, this is great. The passion of these two players, good for Svechnikov for for standing up for himself. And then what happened. You're sitting there and you're going, oh my God, like you're hoping this isn't the worst case scenario. So like the thing is, like I can't fault anybody for their brain being scrambled in that moment. And also, like you said, like you have a personal relationship with the guy. You're invested. I don't think you did anything wrong there. Like at the end of the day, I look at it like this. In that moment, are you acting honestly? Are you acting without malice? Can you look at yourself in the mirror at the end of the night and you can never hide from the person in the mirror? You always know the truth. Are you acting from a place of honesty? And, are you acting from a place of honesty? Were you truthful and honest? And you were. You weren't being malicious to Ovechkin. You were standing up for a guy a kid a kid you spend every day with, a kid you've got a good relationship with. Yeah, like you've got a clean soul on that one, Tripp. No big deal at all.
Well, I appreciate your saying that. And I had actually gone to, I don't know Alex, like I know some of the other guys, in the league, but I had made a point because he's with the way things are set up, the visiting locker room in Raleigh, you really don't see him much. Like I haven't gotten to know Henrik Lundqvist very well over the years because there's one section that even with media availability, you never really see him. And I had made a point to grab Alex at one point earlier last season to tell him that his cup lift was one of the greatest cup lifts I've ever seen. And I mean, it was extraordinary. It is truly, Rod Brindamore's is my favorite. Here being a Detroit guy, Steve Yzerman's, his first one in 97 with Alex Ovechkin's is right there. And I have an attachment with Andre. As it turns out, I think that fight turned the series in Carolina's favor, but it's what makes the game great.
And Ovechkin, he had no malice to the kid.
No.
He was as horrified as anybody else was by what happened. Yep. Unfortunately, it's just one of those situations where it was a bad outcome, but there were no villains, none at all.
Before I let you go, because one of the reasons I love Andre is already, just was the recipient of the Steve Chason award for, by far the youngest Hurricane to ever receive that, which tells you about what his teammates think of him. He has tremendous charisma, Elliotte. You've gotten to know him, and this is going to be tough because I'm going to give you a choice of either just one or top three, both in the player and coaches / manager department. Let's start with players. Who would be the top three, if you want to take the easy way, most charismatic player that you've ever come across?
Oh boy. Wow. I mean, well, I'll tell you, when he played, I loved Daniel Alfredsson. Like he was just a pleasure to deal with. He was funny. I covered some really crushing losses for Ottawa, and he always answered the bell. It was unbelievable to deal with, especially because he was a big star early in my career, even though he was retired. Bob Clark. Wow. If you asked him a question, you were a Flyer, Tripp. So
they had drafted me, but they didn't invite me to camp, and Bobby was the GM.
But you know what? If you asked him a question, you got an honest answer.
Oh, yeah, yes.
And he didn't care what your reaction was.
Yes.
Bob Clark was fantastic. Alfredsson was fantastic. Current guys, I'll tell you, a guy who also gave you exactly what you asked for, whether you liked it or not, was Brind'Amour. Brind'Amour was a fantastic one to deal with. Current guys like Drew Doughty, I think is really, really good. I like, a guy I think is a really thoughtful guy. He's not really outgoing in terms of, but I think his answers are always great. I like Slavin a lot. I like talking to him. I'm looking at this current group of guys. Tyson Barrie, pretty funny guy. I think a guy who's got a lot of personality there, although he doesn't always show it. Seth Jones. The thing that bothers me, Tripp, is there's a lot of guys in this league who got a lot of personality, and they don't show it. And we have to crack that nut. I look at it now, these guys have to let it go.
Yeah.
Come on out. Come out, bring the personalities out, be yourselves. And, I think that one of the things I don't like about people like myself in the media sometimes is we demand people are being honest or be honest, and then we criticize them when we don't like what they say. Can't have it both ways. If you want honesty, you got to deal with some things that maybe you don't like. And I think we have to give players that rope to say, we want you to tell us what you think. And as long as you're not hurting anyone or saying anything offensive, we have to allow them that ability.
Boy, I'm going to wrap this thing up, but you just led me into something, because I will, on the rare Saturday night off, because usually, obviously, the Hurricanes are playing. But if we have a rare Saturday night off or it's an afternoon game, I just love watching your studio because it's informative, but you guys let the personalities fly. I mean, you carve each other if you have to. And I just wish there was more. I want to ask you what your plan would be to bring that out in the players. Like for me, for instance, Elliotte, I'm not even a huge NBA fan, but if TNT is on, I will watch just to watch Charles and the crew. Obviously you have the credibility of the players, on that panel, but any grinders, elite players like you talk about, but just for personality, what would your plan be? If Commissioner Bettman, if he said, Elliotte, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, Donald Fair, the head of the Players Association, how do we let these personalities live, breathe, fly?
Well, I just think that I think the number one thing is, like, when Matthews wore that red coat last year or 2 years, I loved it. Like, I thought that thing was hilarious. Promote the hell out of it. But I think it comes down, like, honestly, I think as much as anything now, a lot of it does come down to social media. Like, I'm fortunate, Tripp. There's 500,000 people that follow me on Twitter, and I appreciate every one of them. The real ones, not the fake ones. But like, if 1% of those people is mad at me, that's 5,000 people. Like, imagine 5,000 people screaming at you at one time. Like, it's a lot. So I think sometimes players get overwhelmed by that. So I think all of us have to be willing, like I said just a second ago, give them a chance to, do crazy stuff without getting ripped for it. Like, I'll tell you, like, we talk a lot about that. One of the things interesting about that TNT show, it was two things. Number one, if you look at the NBA, superstar players are all over the NBA as broadcasters. That NBA show is Shaquille O'Neal, Charles Barkley, and Kenny Smith, who maybe wasn't on that level, but he was a hell of a player.
Yeah.
And, you look at it, Jalen Rose is an NBA commentator. Paul Pierce is an NBA commentator. Like, these are elite level players. In the NHL, the elite guys, they retire. They don't do it. Some of them go into the business, which is fine, but a lot of them aren't interested in media. And, I will say this, to do this job, there's a commitment. Like, a lot of players come in like, wow, I can't believe how much I have to do it. And they've got so much money they don't want to work, which is, I wish I could do that. So that has to change. But the other thing too is, and I've talked about this, the NBA and TNT has a segment that Barkley does. It's called Who He Play For. And basically they put up like a guy who's deep in the depth of a team, and they ask him, what team does he play for? And it's really funny because half the time he doesn't know. Tripp, and I've said this to our guys, if we did that segment,
oh yeah,
and one of us didn't know who this guy played for, we'd get destroyed.
Oh yeah.
like, Elliotte Friedman doesn't know this guy plays for this team. Like, what a loser. And I wonder if it's just the whole basketball versus hockey mentality, but I think the hockey mentality has to change. I think we have to change and just say, guys, we're going to do things a little differently here, and we're going to embrace it.
I'm just thinking it would be Death Star destruction if you do that. Amen, Roger, that. Elliotte, I'm going to ask you one final question. Stories develop all the time. But if you had to pick one story that you're thinking about might rise above all the other ones with this incredibly unique Stanley Cup playoff tournament, if you will, coming up, what would that be that intrigues you the most?
That's a great question, Tripp. I mean, the number one story is, are we going to be able to pull this off? Like, that's that's by far the number one story. And you're encouraged by some of the testing numbers in the NBA and in soccer, and men's soccer in particular looked like it was on the precipice of disaster a week ago. But, you know, I'll tell you this, like, I look at the number one story, I think, is there's going to be a player who comes out of this as the big winner. Like, there's going to be one player everybody's going to look at here, and you're going to say, this guy, under unbelievable circumstances, had the year of his career. And I'm very curious to see who that is. And even though he's already great, my early prediction is McDavid could dominate these playoffs.
Wow. I was going to ask you if you'd be willing to take a chance, because Columbus took one when he sailed for America, and who it would be. Connor McDavid.
Yeah. But you think I'll give you someone else, because Connor McDavid is like picking, like, if there was a world Super Bowl, it's like picking the United States, right? Like, you know, that's so. I'm trying to think of another player. Like, you know what? Here, I'll give you one. I'll give you one. It'll be near and dear to your fan base. Dougie Hamilton. Because there was a time that Dougie Hamilton, there was no chance he was going to play in the playoffs this year, right? Mm-hmm. And he was having a dynamite year. Like, I'm pretty sure he's on my Norris ballot. Like, he was having a dynamite year. And now he gets a second chance. I wonder if he's going to be, Connor McDavid's too easy. I'll give you Dougie Hamilton at the end.
Well, the Caniac Nation, Elliotte, whenever you come down to the Carolinas, oh boy. I mean, Governor Roy Cooper's a huge Caniac. I mean, listen, it's going to be carte blanche after you pick Dougie Hamilton as the guy that could possibly write a great story. You know,
Tripp, I got to tell you, it's been too long since I've had a good steak at Sullivan's, so I look forward to coming down at some point.
I can't wait to do that with you. And I just closed in thanking you by saying, think about it. I was lucky enough to back up one game in the league, and now to have a career over 2 decades in the game. And I try to learn from guys like you to improve and constantly try to excel at my craft. But something that exceeds that in spades is that I have gotten to meet, due to the greatest game on the planet, mm-hmm. friends that will be friends forever that I never would have probably come across otherwise. Mm-hmm. And that is the highlight of the human experience, and why I love the greatest game on planet Earth, hockey, so much. And you're one of those guys. Can't thank you enough for digging in with me. And I love to learn from you. I love to pick your brain. And it means a lot that you joined the show.
Well, I really appreciate it, Tripp, and the feeling is mutual. There was a pretty funny story when we stumbled into each other outside the Ritz-Carlton earlier this year on a Carolina-Toronto road trip. That was a pretty late night, but it's great to, Tripp, the feeling's mutual, and, we're lucky. It's a great sport, and there's a lot of great people in it. And I really do think there's a lot of great coverage of it, a lot of different people who do great work. So it's really my pleasure to come on, Tripp, and I look forward to getting a chance to see you sometime in the future.
Well, that was a lot of fun. I think that Elliotte, both in the reporter and insider capacity, all different kinds of ways to dig in elite fashion. And when it comes to scoops, trust, etc., I mean, he digs in, and he digs in deep. So that was a ton of fun for me. I wouldn't have gotten to enjoy it if it wasn't with gratitude to our great sponsors, the great people at the Allstate Fastener Corporation, one of the leading fastener distributors on planet Earth. Any type of fastener, their range is unlimited. They're a distributor, not a manufacturer. Locations all over the planet, every continent with the exception of Australia and Antarctica. Who knows? Maybe they'll be in Antarctica soon. They provide vendor-managed inventory. They can bring it right to your production line. Industries, just to name a few: automotive, heavy truck, tractor trailer, earth moving, which of course is near and dear to my heart, considering that earth moving, they dig in, medical, gaming. So learn more about Allstate Fastener, allstatefastener.com. The great people at the Vintage Wine Company, a wholesale producer within the state of Michigan for a complete assortment of top-end wine to valued wines. Very, very knowledgeable people. The owners, Mike and Michelle Giorgio. You can learn more about them if you have wholesale needs within the state of Michigan at VWCMI for Michigan.com. And finally, a new sponsor to this episode, and I'm very proud to say this, Andrew and Brandy Ladd. They just celebrated an anniversary, and they have really done a sensational job with an incredible charity and a sturgeon fishing tournament every July. It was canceled this July because of COVID in Western Canada, where you get a chance to fish with NHL stars for sturgeon on a boat, and all the proceeds go to enrich the lives of kids. It's a fabulous undertaking that Andrew and his beautiful wife, Brandy, just celebrating an anniversary that they are heavily involved in. I encourage you to find out more about what they've been doing and will continue to do, and get involved at Ladd Foundation. Of course, that's Ladd with 2Ds.org. Thank you so much to our sponsors for their current and continued support.
We're digging in with Tripp today, yeah. Today, yeah. Today, yeah. Today.